Welcome to Really This Week in History for February 27th, 2021. I'm your host, Daniel Price. This week I will be speaking with Dr. Ronald A. Smith, sports historian and author of The Myth of the Amateur, A History of College Athletic Scholarships, about Notre Dame and Northwestern's decisions to pull out of EA Sports' upcoming college football game. But before we get started, let me remind you that the website for the podcast is RTWIhistory.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at RTWI History. You can also support the podcast by going to patreon.com/RTWI History. I recorded, edited, and published this podcast using the free Anchor app. It combines all the tools you need to create your own podcast with little to no experience of your own. Not only does it allow you to record right in the app, it also helps you distribute your podcast to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more services. You can even make money from your podcast with sponsored ads with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
On Monday, February 22nd, Notre Dame announced that it would not be lending its name, logos, or brand to EA Sports' soon-to-be-rebooted NCAA football game until legislation allowing college athletes to benefit from their name, image, and likeness is finalized. And on Thursday, Northwestern joined them. You might remember that Northwestern's football team, led by then-quarterback Kane Coulter, attempted to unionize in 2015. With me to discuss the story and put some perspective on it is Dr. Ronald A. Smith, Professor Emeritus at Penn State University and author of the upcoming book, The Myth of the Amateur, A History of College Athletic Scholarships. Ron also wrote the 2010 book, Pay for Play, A History of Big-Time College Athletic Reform, among many other titles. Ron, thanks for joining me.
It's good to be with you, and we're not going to send you any more snow or anything like that down your direction.
I hope not. In regards to Notre Dame and now Northwestern sitting out the video game, is that surprising to you, or is it something you expected? Is it something that you expect to see more schools or maybe even conferences join in doing?
It's not a particular surprise to me, but there's a whole lot of things that are not a surprise to me. Lawsuits and Congress making bills relative to names, images, and likenesses, or schools saying we're not going to sign on to any of the EA productions of sport games unless the athletes are paid. There are a whole lot of coaches that know athletes are the ones that are getting the short end of the stick in terms of all the money that's going into athletics. If there's a $15 billion a year thing, athletes do get things for sure, but relative to what coaches who are making over $10 million a year now, college athletes often do not, they come out with a slight debt, even though they're on full scholarship.
Yeah, and I remember when I was growing up, I played those EA Sports games, and one of the first things I would do was go in and match the player who already had their number, their height, their weight, their general skill set loaded into the game, and I would change their names, which was a thing that you could do in that game. Eventually, companies, not companies, but fans started creating downloadable rosters. That the day you got the game, you could download the roster of every college team, and there it was, and the players were seeing nothing. So when EA Sports killed the brand, it was a surprise to me. I think a surprise to many. What was your reaction to them bringing it back, and what was the reaction of the community, if you know?
Well, first of all, let me say that it was not surprising that EA killed the brand. They killed the brand because they were going to be sued into oblivion for not paying people like Ed O'Bannon, whose case ended up as antitrust action against EA Sports and the NCAA, and they had to pay millions of dollars because they were using names like Ed O'Bannon, the great basketball player at UCLA, a national champion, was not paid, and he and a number of others sued the NCAA and EA Sports, and I don't know, it was a $40 or $50 million or something like that cost to EA Sports. So they were going to lose a lot more and maybe be put out of business because of it. They didn't do it because they thought it was a good idea to get rid of college sports. Now they're coming back in because in almost for sure college athletes are going to be paid for their names, images, and likenesses, the so-called NIL. And that's going to occur this year. My guess is there will be a federal legislation, and the most recent legislation came this month when Senator Murphy, Chris Murphy, I think it is, entered a bill that will ensure, if it passes, that athletes will be able to get agents. They will be able to collectively bargain in a way for their NIL rights and then be paid for jerseys and their signatures and those kinds of things, just like any other student at your North Carolina or my Northwestern or wherever can, if they play trumpet in the symphony orchestra or violin, and then they want to have a quartet and get paid for it, they can do that. If you're an athlete, you may not do that, and you'll lose your eligibility if you do it now. And the NCAA has been fighting this for well over a decade now. And pretty soon, there will be by the end of March, there will be a U.S. Supreme Court case on this very subject, and more likely there will be federal legislation, because now there are something like 6 or 7 states that have passed NIL legislation, and that'll never work. You need a national policy on it, and that probably will come out of some senator's bill, like Chris Murphy, who is a senator from Connecticut.
Now, name, image, and likeness, the so-called NIL, is just one of what seems like a billion-side dice of the amateur status of college athletes. So what I'd like you to do is tell me a bit more about amateurism in college sports throughout history, something you have a great knowledge of, and tell me what led you to write The Myth of the Amateur, and a little bit more than a decade ago, Pay for Play, and what you've learned in the decade between. Well,
first of all, I'm an old guy, and I've been researching intercollegiate athletics since the 1960s, when I wrote my doctoral dissertation at the University of Wisconsin, looking at the history of a conference, which were the kind of normal schools, teachers' colleges that almost every state had. Wisconsin had some, like lacrosse normal school, teachers' college. I did that history, and I got interested in writing intercollegiate athletic history. And there, when I took my position at Penn State, the first place I decided to research was the Ivy League schools. And in doing that, I came across the whole concept of amateurism. And when I looked at Harvard and Yale, their first contest, the first contest in America, intercollegiate contest, happened to be a crew rowing match between the two of them on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, because a railroad magnate asked the person who was head of the rowing crew at Yale, if you get a match between you and Harvard, I will take you up to Lake Winnipesaukee and give you an 8-day paid vacation. Now, is that paying of an athlete? That's, I think, a very good pay. And I took these kinds of notes down and then never did a whole lot with that in terms of the question of amateurism. And I decided several years ago that I would pull all the material I had and do some more research on amateurism. And I was pretty well satisfied at that point that amateurism is a myth, that there really isn't amateur sport at most levels, including, in my estimation, Division II and Division III, where theoretically they don't give out athletic scholarships. They just give scholarships to athletes in Division III. All of those people are being paid. I happen to have a granddaughter who was recruited to play soccer at a very nice liberal arts school at Haverford. And even though she was a straight A student in high school, she might not have gotten into Haverford had she not been a soccer player. And I've got another granddaughter who is a very good runner, who is going to go to Amherst next year, and who knows whether she would have gotten into Amherst, even though she's never had anything but an A in high school, because that's what they can get at Amherst, those kinds of students. Sort of like you at North Carolina. Straight A student, and you got in. Or me at Northwestern. I got into Northwestern, and I was a good student in high school, but who knows if I'd have gotten in had I not been a good baseball and basketball player.
Well, I can't lie. I got a few B's in high school and maybe a C. I had to transfer in after a year at UNC Greensboro.
We won't talk about that. Amateurism, anyway, has been a real interest of mine, and I've come to the conclusion that amateurism should be dropped as a subject. It shouldn't even be in the NCAA Constitution. It's got 20 pages in the NCAA Constitution bylaws on amateurism, but they ought to drop the term because it's false. Every athlete is paid in some way or another, as I was at Northwestern. I had an athletic scholarship. I was given a scholastic scholarship to go to Northwestern, and they told me if you don't keep a B average, we'll make it an athletic scholarship. I thought that was a pretty good deal.
Seems fair. You kept that average though, right?
I did okay. I graduated, and I've done fairly well academically my entire life. I was not a straight A student, but I was a good student. But I played a lot of basketball and baseball.
Now,
I should say I played a lot of baseball, and I was on the basketball team.
Now, the NIL legislation that you talked about and a potential federal NIL law, in your opinion, is that going to be a domino that could lead to more walls falling and more overt pay of athletes, not scholarships, not room and board, but money and not stipends, which nowadays I believe student athletes even get stipends, but not small stipends, but larger direct payment to athletes for playing sports in college.
Well, it's interesting to me because there are athletes today that get paid a great deal of money, more than their athletic scholarship. Most people do not even have no clue that there are two major funds at the NCAA with up to $100 million in each fund. One is called an Academic Enhancement Fund, AEF, and another a Student Assistant Fund, SAF. And you can, depending upon your needs, you can get $10,000 or $20,000 out of those funds above your athletic scholarship if you need them, depending upon how need is defined. And then I will say this. If you are an Olympian and you win a gold medal in America, you might win $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 for having won that gold medal, and then you can play college sports. For instance, some of you have heard of Katie Ledecky. She was a swimmer with gold medals in the 2016 Olympics. She ended up earning $355,000 in the Olympics. And then they invited her to participate in swimming at Stanford University, and it was allowed. Even more than that was a guy from Singapore by the name of Joseph Schooling, who beat Phelps, and Singapore paid him something over $700,000 for winning that gold medal. And guess what? He ended up on the University of Texas swimming team. Now, are those guys paid? Are they amateur? So it doesn't bother me too much that athletes get paid. They're just like if you were a really good trombone player and you were able to be in an orchestra and pull in $1,000 on a weekend, playing several gigs. It doesn't bother me if you are that person, or if you get paid to be in a play, or you're a dancer and you get paid to be dancing and you're a college student. I don't care if they're professional or, quote, amateur. They should be able to be paid, and so it doesn't bother me. And I know there's some problems with it, but you asked the question whether I think it could open those doors. Yeah, it could open those doors. Right now, it's mostly just on your name, image, and likeness. And if you sell out to have your name or your number on the back of a jersey or a hoodie, or you're signing photographs or whatever and selling those, a few people can make a lot of money from that. Good for them. They're stars. They should be paid. Just like you will be on this podcast when you get 1 million people listening to your podcast.
And if
You'll
I did
be
it
rich.
in college, I could still work for the Daily Tar Heel if I was doing this in college and gaining money in a similar field.
By the way, your institution, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the student newspaper there this last summer decided that they are no longer going to use the term student athlete.
Oh, really?
Student athlete should never be used. You never hear of anyone who is a student musician or a student dancer or a student chemistry player. Chemistry student. The only place student-something is used in athletics, and the reason that was done was to make it look like athletes were not professionals, and they would therefore universities would not be taxed for gate receipts, and workers' compensation wouldn't be used, which would save university millions of dollars. And that came in the 1950s. There's a absolute one place that student athletes is used. I never use it. I never use the term because I think it's fraudulent. And it was used only to prevent taxing and workers' compensation and the payment of workers' compensation taxes coming out of the 1950s in the National Collegiate Athletics, and the person who was the first executive director, Walter Byers. So I don't use that term.
Now, Ron, I know what you think the NCAA should do as far as the amateur goes. Whether they are going to do that, looks like it's still very up in the air. College football, major college football, the Power 5 conferences, there has been for a good while now, kind of an underground movement of fans and maybe some administrators that are pushing for them to separate from the NCAA and do their own thing And at that point, none of the players would be obligated to be quote unquote amateur, quote unquote student athletes. Is that something that you see as a real possibility, or do you think that the NCAA might just catch up with the thought processes of, I think, most people?
Well, first of all, I don't think the Power Five will withdraw from the NCAA. There are too many benefits about being in the NCAA. One of them is it makes it look like the athletes are going to the university for an education. Many of them are, some of them are not. But I don't think they're going to withdraw from that. If they were going to withdraw from the NCAA, the Power Five conferences, they would have done it in the 1970s and 80s when there was something called the College Football Association. And the College Football Association, almost no one knows that term anymore, was the major conferences minus the Big Ten and the Pac-10, but it's a Southeast Conference and the Atlantic Coast Conference and other conferences. They decided to break up the television contract that the NCAA had because they weren't getting enough of that money. And so they took it to the federal court, and the Supreme Court said, it's a monopoly of the TV, and we will do away with the NCAA controlling football. Now, as you know, every conference has its own, plus Notre Dame has its own program, and they're doing very well with that. But you also notice that the NCAA has control of the basketball, and the NCAA is funded over 90% of its budget comes from March Madness television. And I don't think the Power Five, especially the football powers, will break away because that would ruin, in some ways, their basketball money. And that is a huge sum of money. It's $1 billion over some years. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the news of the week that kind of led us to this discussion, one thing I like to do is kind of put ourselves into the minds of future historians, people that are going to be writing books like yours 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now. And what do you see just the reboot of the video game and the initial holdout of Notre Dame and Northwestern and any other schools that may or may not join? Where does that stand? Is it a paragraph in a chapter? Is it its own chapter? Is it a footnote?
Well, it's probably a book. This is a big thing. This whole thing. What Notre Dame is doing this week in Northwestern today, a number of other schools will also do, but I think that part of it is more or less irrelevant. What is going to happen, I can almost predict it, is that by summer there will be a federal law that will do away with all this other stuff. The Supreme Court case, which is the NCAA versus Alston, that's going to be tried in another month. That will be done away with by a federal law that will give athletes a great deal more opportunity. And I don't care whether you're in Division 1, 2, or 3 of the NCAA, all of those will have free access. It won't just be the big Power 5 football schools. It'll be everybody will have access. If you're in a Division 3 school, you can sell your jersey. Now, they probably won't sell many, but you can do it. So it's fair. And if you're a woman athlete, you'll be able to do it. And a few, like Katie Ledecky, will be able to do that. And I saw a case where And it came out of the O'Bannon, I think, or the California law that is going to do away with NCAA controls on names, images, and likenesses. But a former basketball player at Connecticut, women basketball player who played professional baseball, I can't think of her name right now, said, "Look, they're still selling my jersey in Connecticut, and I'm not making a cent off of it." I don't think that's right. I think athletes and students as in general should have their rights to their name and their image, and if it's worth something, they should profit by it. So I don't think in the future, I think there will be a law that will allow all of this to happen. And it's a big thing because it's going to do away, in my estimation, with amateurism. The NCAA changes the definition of amateurism every few years to incorporate more money going to athletes. And to me, amateurism is playing for nothing, for the love of it. And I don't think many athletes at the higher levels do it just for the love of it. They see a future in it. They see something that they're very interested in, and they do like to do it, but they like to benefit from it also. And only 2% of those basketball and football players play pro out of those major conferences. It's a very low percentage that make the pros. Although most of us who were in college that were fairly good all thought we can play pro and maybe make the majors or the big time.
All right. Well, Ron, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate this. The Myth of the Amateur, A History of College Athletic Scholarships, comes out on May 4th this year. You can pre-order it on Amazon right now. I will have a link to the pre-order page in the episode description. And you can currently get most of Ron's titles on Amazon as well. Is there anywhere else that people can find your books?
Those are two pretty good places. You can write to the University of Texas Press and get it directly from them because they're the ones that are publishing it. And anyway, I think you're doing a fine job, Daniel, and good luck keeping this going and get some other stronger members to talk about sports on your program. They'll enjoy it.
I really appreciate you saying that. I really appreciate you spending time with me. Thanks so much.
Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone at home for joining us. I hope today's conversation was as enlightening for you as it was for me. Please come back next week when I will be discussing more of the history we live through every day.